Good morning. I am David, and thank you for joining me in this episode of The Late Disciple. We continue our discussion of the book of Matthew today as Jesus delivers his Sermon on the Mount, which Matthew covers in great detail in chapters 5, 6, and 7. Matthew first tells us in rather plain language that Jesus saw the crowds of people and then went up a mountainside where he sat and began to teach his disciples. The Bible frequently makes note of Jesus being in a seated position when teaching or preaching, and this was actually a common practice among rabbis in this period. Jesus begins the sermon with what are now referred to as the Beatitudes. These are the blessings that Jesus bestows upon the poor and downtrodden. The conventional wisdom at this time was that contentment was something only the powerful and rich experienced. But Jesus turns these assumptions on their head and instead states that it is not the successful and the powerful who are blessed. It is instead the poor in spirit, those who mourn, those who are meek or gentle, those who hunger for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. The people listening to Jesus, many of whom were without spiritual hope, are now being told to rejoice and be glad, because their reward is in heaven, and it is a great reward. And he further encourages them that even in this life, they are the light of the world. After this uplifting opening, Jesus emphasizes that he has not come to replace existing law or the words of the prophets, but instead to fulfill them, and in fact affirms the complete truth and authority of the Old Testament as the Word of God. He then delineates numerous examples, but reveals the deeper moral meaning of the law, showing that true righteousness requires inward alignment with its spirit, not just outward obedience to its letter. For example, murder. Jesus tells the crowd that not only will one who murders be subject to judgment, but so too will be judged anyone who is angry with a brother or sister. This is because the same sins of hatred and anger can ultimately lead to murder. Then, through examples, he emphasizes the importance of reconciliation, even if it is the wrong person who takes the initiative to do so. Similarly, with adultery, Jesus tells us that if anyone looks lustfully at a woman, they have already committed adultery. Again, Jesus emphasizes the intent of the law over the letter of the law. Throughout the sermon, we see contrasts between Jesus' ethical teachings and the prevailing Jewish interpretations. On the topics of giving to the needy, prayer, and fasting, he tells us to perform these acts of righteousness with humility, not fanfare. True righteousness is the act itself performed, not the act as observed or perceived by others. In his last admonition, beginning in chapter 7, Jesus warns not to judge others. This is a caution that has stood the test of time. I doubt you'll find anyone who has not heard and probably used a variation of this phrase. I think most of us assume that Jesus is telling us not to judge others at all, but upon closer inspection, the lesson here is to first introspectively judge ourselves. Only after doing so might we be able to discern a defect in someone else's character. What I found interesting was the pearls before swine statement in this chapter. It wasn't until I began researching that I found the meaning behind this. The pearls represent the teaching of the Bible, and the dogs and pigs represent unbelievers who disdain and reject these teachings. Thus, it is a waste of time to cast your pearls before such creatures, once you've made such a determination. And this discernment ties right back into our conversation about judging others after we have appropriately judged ourselves. I've also read speculation that this also is the reason that Jesus did not perform miracles on non-believers. And while this may seem to fly in the face of love your enemies as you would your neighbor, the principle here guides how the gospel should be shared when confronting those who reject or despise the truth, not how one treats their enemy. Before closing the sermon, Jesus gives us what becomes two more well-known teachings: seek and ye shall find, and do unto others. In the first instance, where Jesus tells us, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be opened to you. In this, we're being told the importance of persistent prayer. In the second instance, Jesus relays what eventually comes to be known as the Golden Rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Specifically, in the NIV version of the Bible, so, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. What you may find interesting is that 600 years earlier, the Chinese philosopher Confucius also suggested his own golden rule, but delivered a bit differently. Specifically, he wrote, "What I do not want others to do to me, I have no desire to do to others." It's a bit of an inverse of what Jesus says, but we get to the same place. And no, I'm not suggesting that Jesus plagiarized Confucius. And now we come to the end of the sermon, where Jesus speaks of two types of gates, two types of prophets, two types of disciples, and lastly, a parable discussing two types of buildings. The two gates are assumed to be the entrance of the kingdom of heaven, but the wide gate, the easy path, is the path that many will follow, while it is the narrow gate, the more difficult path, which is the one that leads to Christ. The two prophets are also presumed to lead to the path of the kingdom, but the false prophet is the wolf in sheep's clothing and will lead to the wide gate. We can discern between the true and the false prophet by the fruit they bear. A good tree bears good fruit, while a bad tree bears bad fruit. The two disciples are represented by the false disciple, who claims to have performed many wondrous works, but this is an assertion that works depict faith and righteousness, when instead it is true that it is faith itself which produces the good works, this being the true disciple. Lastly, we end with the parable of the wise and foolish builders, in which Jesus tells his listeners that if they heard his words and put them into practice, they have wisely built their house on rock. Even as the rain comes, streams rise, and winds blow and beat against the house, it will not fall because of its firm foundation. Conversely, for those who heard his words but did not put them into practice, they have foolishly built their house on sand, and their house will be swept away in the rain and the wind. Matthew writes that the crowds were amazed by Jesus' teachings. And this was because they were used to other teachers quoting other scribes and rabbis to support their own teachings and creating an authority with a personal bias that supported their personal ambitions. Jesus taught with a divine authority they had not before experienced. And Jesus' presence and authority was soon to become known far and wide. If you enjoyed this video, please press the like button, and if you didn't, by all means, press that other button. Of course, feel free to leave a comment to share your own opinions or reactions, and please do consider subscribing for the next chapter in this journey. And as always, remember, we are all disciples. It is never too late.